This here is the Radeon HD 7770 and it's a budget / mid-range graphics card from 2012, and in my typical fashion I decided to see what it can do and what it can't do in the modern day. Is it a graphics card which is strictly for retro use, or can you get away with playing some relatively modern titles on it? Well, there's only one way to find out, and that's to test it. The HD 7770 marks the end of my retro showcase of the older GCN graphics cards, but you can watch both the PS4 and Xbox One's GPUs in a video up there, or well, there's two videos, there'll be links in the description, okay? But back to the HD 7770, and I'm going to keep my expectations in check for this video because I'm well aware that this graphics card is weaker than the pair of the GPUs I've recently taken a look at, so this is something I have to put into account. So I'm not really expecting that much today, but this is the 2GB model of this graphics card, so I can get away with some slightly higher textures in some games where this was a notable problem with the 7790, as that only had a single gigabyte of VRAM. And this Asus dual fan model is a seemingly decent one for the HD 7770, and it's also got slightly bumped memory and core clocks, which might help out its gaming performance today. By how much, I'm not too sure. And speaking of which, to find out said performance, I've tested it at 1080p as I've somewhat got away with it today. And like always, all testing has been done in my Ryzen 5 7600 testing PC, which has 32GB of CL32 6200MHz DDR5 memory, a Western Digital SN770 NVMe Gen 4 SSD, and an MSI X670E Tomahawk. I've left the HD 7770 at its stock out of the box settings, and I've used the official AMD legacy drivers, as the NIMS drivers don't really do that much in terms of performance for these older graphics cards. So let's see how it gets on. Fortnite's always a really good test of these older graphics cards, as it's pretty easy to run and it's got a lot of modern relevance, and in all fairness, it runs pretty decently on this old GCN graphics card with 88 FPS on the average and 49 FPS for that 1% low. So this old budget mid-range GCN graphics card does have a pretty decent time in this title. Where you will start to struggle a bit though is Counter-Strike 2, however. 50 FPS for that average frame rate and 43 for the 1% low means, yes, the frame time is quite smooth, but it's averaging not a lot for a competitive shooter in my opinion, and I did find this quite hard to play as I am used to more than like 90ish FPS in Counter-Strike, so that was a bit of a problem. Do I recommend this GPU for CS though? Probably not. The high preset might have been a bridge too far for the HD 7770 in GTA 5, but the high textures weren't, because the 2GB of VRAM is plenty fine for the high textures in this game. But the actual core compute of this GPU probably isn't enough for the rest of the settings that come with the high preset, because 46 FPS on average and 38 FPS for the 1% low is all the HD 7770 is good for in this title. Is it playable? Certainly. Is it much smoother than something like the Xbox One? Definitely. In all fairness though, it's still not brilliant performance. Looking at some slightly better performance in Skyrim Special Edition, the HD 7770 has a relatively decent time here. Yes, this GPU is only getting 50 FPS for the average and 37 for the 1% low, which means it's not maxing out the engine cap in this game, but that's okay. Most of us probably grew up with Skyrim at 30 FPS on something like the Xbox 360 or maybe the Special Edition on Xbox One, which were both locked to 30 FPS and probably drop below that quite often. But in all fairness, I would probably take 50 FPS on the low preset. But if you had the original Skyrim from 2011, you'd probably get much better performance there. So if you've got that and a HD 7770, that's definitely what I'd recommend. What I can recommend playing, however, is Battlefield 4. This insanely fun shooter is still very alive and kicking on PC, especially with the private servers. I've played quite a lot actually, and the HD 7770 put up a decent fight today. 91 FPS on average with a 1% low in the low 70s means the game runs pretty decently, and the cherry on top of it is we got away with the high textures thanks to the 2GB of VRAM, so that is great to see. And Battlefield 4 doesn't really look that bad on the low preset, as it's a game that's aged pretty decently. A game that's also aged pretty decently is Halo Reach on the Master Chief Collection. Even on the original preset, the HD 7770 had a decent time here, with 63 FPS on average and a 1% low of 51. Yes, it's not the most brilliant gaming experience in the world, as some of these older GCN graphics cards can easily get above 100 FPS in this title, but what I do have to say is, it's still very playable, and it looks much better than like the release Xbox 360 version of this game, as it's a much higher resolution, it looks a lot sharper, and you're also getting double the frame rate, so that's pretty good in my opinion. And now we move on to Rainbow Six Siege, where that magical 60 FPS figure, which I like to set as a minimum for competitive shooters, isn't achievable today, with 49 FPS on average, with a pretty, I'd like to say, lackluster 1% low of 33 frames per second, which leads me to believe if you were looking for a decently competitive Rainbow Six Siege experience, I don't think the 7770 is going to be the GPU for you, so I'd give this one a miss. So, in all fairness, I don't think it's the most inspiring or most breathtaking graphics card I've taken a look at this year, but in all fairness, in the games that it was sort of like aimed to play when it sort of released, it didn't do that bad of a job. If you dial back the years quite a bit to games like Battlefield 4, Skyrim Special Edition, and even Halo Master Chief Collection, this old little GPU does a relatively decent job in these titles, especially in Battlefield 4. If you put that onto the low preset to get as much frames as possible, you will get around 90ish FPS at 1080p, which is still quite a decent showing for this little GPU. And in the case of Skyrim, yes, it didn't get 60 FPS, but this was the special edition, which was a sort of rehashed re-release of Skyrim, as the original launch was in 2011, and this would have ran that totally fine. So if on Steam you've got the original Skyrim, which isn't sold anymore, you'd probably be better off playing that version on this GPU. But if you want to play Skyrim Special Edition, I mean, this graphics card can do it. As for the competitive games, yeah, they're not really that doable on this graphics card. Rainbow Six Siege isn't really that playable, as you're getting less than 60 FPS, which is like the minimum I recommend for competitive games like that. Fortnite wasn't too bad, even though the 1% lows were pretty horrid, but that's just an Unreal Engine 5 moment, as it's just a terrible engine with frame pacing issues all the time. And there was Counter-Strike, where it wasn't the most playable experience, I'll be honest. I did find it kind of hard chugging along at the frame rate it was, because it just didn't feel great with the mouse. It felt like my mouse was in like soup or something. It just didn't feel right. But hey, this could be me just being used to high frame rates anyway, so there is that. You might be aware that I haven't tested any modern AAA titles like Cyberpunk, and the reason to that is, if a graphics card like the 7850 is going to struggle in them, this certainly will. And even if this will launch a modern AAA title, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to run them very well in any sort of reasonable capacity. So it's just a blanket, any modern AAA game is just not going to run well on this GPU. But if I'm being honest with you, if you wanted to play a later Xbox 360 era or early Xbox One, I'd say no later than sort of 2015. The 7770 is not too bad for it, especially the 2GB model as well. And before even testing the HD 7770, I knew I wasn't going to recommend a budget graphics card from 12 years ago, simply because for the 20 quid I paid for this, you can get much more powerful graphics cards like the HD 7850, which is, well, the PS4's GPU, which you can watch in a video up there after this one though. And that will massively outperform this graphics card. And also, if you were to spend a bit more money, you could get something like an RX 470 or even 570 4GB. Yes, these have still got 4GB of VRAM, which really isn't enough in 2024, but it's double this. And they've also got DirectX 12 feature level support, which is something that's notably lacking on this. And AMD also still support Polaris in a weird sort of fashion. They support it and they don't support it at the same time. It's kind of weird, but the support is much more vast than something like this old HD card. But if you truly want a graphics card that will play like 99.99999% of the games out there today, you can watch this GPU up here. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next one.